I buried my husband 7 days ago, and now my own family is standing in my kitchen telling me he left the money he never once mentioned to me. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I had spent a week swallowing grief while everyone around me spoke in careful voices, as if Arthur's death had turned me fragile overnight. Daniel lowered his eyes. Melissa did not. She stood beside my dining table with one hand resting on a cream-colored envelope that had arrived that morning from North Valley Mutual. I had opened it expecting another form connected to Arthur's funeral expenses. Instead, the first line said there was a dispute involving the beneficiary designation on an $850,000 life insurance policy. I read it 3 times. Arthur and I had been married 43 years. We shared one checking account, one mortgage, one ancient filing cabinet, and nearly every secret 2 people could collect across a lifetime. Or so I had believed. Dad handled that before he passed, Melissa said, too quickly. Daniel shifted near the window. Outside, an August storm pressed gray clouds over Columbus, and the old maple branches scraped softly against the glass. Handled what? I asked. Neither of them answered at first. That silence frightened me more than the letter. Then Melissa slid a photocopy toward me. A beneficiary change form. 70% to Daniel Whitmore. 30% to Evelyn Whitmore. My own name looked strange printed beneath my son's, as if I had become a minor character in my marriage. Arthur wanted things to be fair, Melissa said. He knew Daniel needed help. Daniel finally looked at me. Mom, I didn't ask him to do this. But he didn't say he would refuse the money either. I stared at the date beside Arthur's signature. March 14th. Something cold moved through me. Not fear exactly. Recognition. On March 14th, Arthur had been at Riverside Methodist Hospital. I had sat beside him most of that day, listening to the mechanical hum of the room and complaining about the coffee being terrible. That evening, half awake, Arthur had gripped my wrist with surprising strength and said something I had dismissed as medication and exhaustion. Dates tell the truth when people don't, Evie. He had never explained it. I had forgotten it until that moment. Then the grandfather clock in the hallway stopped. The sound was small, just one missing tick, but all 3 of us noticed. Melissa glanced toward it. Daniel frowned. I felt my heartbeat climb because that clock had belonged to Arthur's father, and in 30 years it had never stopped unless someone removed the brass key. I walked over and looked at the frozen hands. 3:42. My eyes dropped to the photocopy again. The notary stamp beside Arthur's signature carried a time. 3:42 p.m. March 14th. Melissa was saying something behind me, but I barely heard her. Because at exactly 3:42 that afternoon, I knew where Arthur had been, and I knew he had not been signing anything. I left the clock frozen at 3:42. I don't know why. Maybe part of me was afraid that if I touched it, whatever Arthur had been trying to tell me would disappear. Melissa watched me too closely while Daniel kept insisting there had to be an explanation. I wanted one too. I wanted something ordinary enough to let me sleep that night. Instead, the next morning I drove 6 miles downtown to see Harold Mercer, the attorney Arthur had trusted for nearly 20 years. The city looked painfully normal through my windshield. People carried coffee across crosswalks. A delivery truck blocked half a lane. Somewhere, a radio host laughed about the weather. I remember resenting every ordinary thing I saw. Arthur had been gone only a week, yet the world had already decided to keep moving. I kept one hand tight around the envelope on the passenger seat, as if letting go of it might make the question inside it real. Harold was 64, silver-haired, patient, and careful with words. When I placed the beneficiary form on his desk, he didn't react the way Melissa had. He didn't call it fair. He didn't call it suspicious. He simply put on his glasses and read every line twice. Evelyn, do you remember leaving Arthur alone at any point on March 14th? I did. The question made my stomach tighten because I had tried not to think about those 40 minutes. Around 3 that afternoon, I drove home to get Arthur a clean shirt, his reading glasses, and the navy blanket he always complained the hospital kept too cold at 68 degrees. Daniel had been working. Melissa had told me she might stop by. Harold made a note. So someone could have seen him during that window. Maybe, I said. But Arthur was exhausted. Harold leaned back. Exhausted doesn't automatically mean incapable. That was the first crack in the certainty I had carried into his office. What if Arthur really had changed the policy? What if the secret wasn't what Melissa had done, but what my husband had chosen not to tell me? That thought followed me home like a shadow. Daniel called before dinner. His voice sounded smaller than usual. He said Arthur had once told him, "Someday, I'll make sure you're okay." Daniel had taken it as reassurance, nothing more. Now he wondered if it meant the insurance money. I hated how reasonable that sounded. By 7, I had almost convinced myself the form might be real. Then Harold called. He had tracked down the notary listed on the document, a woman named Claire Donnelly, who worked out of Dublin, Ohio. I expected him to say her stamp was fake. Instead, he said the commission number was valid. Her signature matched public records. Even the embossed seal appeared legitimate. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Then Arthur signed it, I said. Harold didn't answer immediately. Behind me, the grandfather clock suddenly gave one single tick. Just one. I turned toward the hallway. The hands were still stuck at 3:42. Harold, I whispered. His voice lowered. Claire remembers March 14th very clearly. She kept a full appointment log. I gripped the phone tighter. Was she at the hospital? No. A pause. Evelyn. She told me she has never met Arthur Whitmore in her life. For several seconds, I could hear nothing but the faint electrical hum of my refrigerator and the single impossible tick still echoing in my head. Harold told me Claire Donnelly was certain. She had notarized documents on March 14th, but none for Arthur, none at Riverside Methodist, and none connected to North Valley Mutual. Someone had used her legitimate commission information without her knowledge. The next afternoon, Daniel came over alone. That surprised me. Melissa rarely let him handle anything involving money without standing beside him. He sat at my kitchen table, turning his wedding ring around his finger while I told him what Harold had learned. "Mom, there's something you should see," he finally said. He opened an email on his phone. It had been sent from an address almost identical to Arthur's and dated March 12th, 2 days before the beneficiary form. The message said Arthur wanted Daniel to have something substantial because he had carried enough burdens on his own. Daniel's eyes filled, but I barely noticed. I was staring at the final line. Love, Arthur. My husband had never signed a family email that way. Not once in 43 years. To Daniel, he wrote Dad. To me, he wrote A. Sometimes just a little heart-shaped doodle he claimed looked like a potato. Who showed you this first? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Melissa. The answer landed harder than I expected. Before I could press him, the grandfather clock sounded again. 3 slow ticks. Then silence. Daniel turned toward the hallway. Mom, you need to get that thing fixed. I stood without answering. The hands had moved. Not far. From 3:42 to 3:45. 3 minutes. 3 ticks. My skin prickled. Arthur had always teased me for believing houses remembered people, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside ours was counting. Harold called that evening with another discovery. Claire had checked her records and found that her notary commission number had appeared months earlier on paperwork processed through an online document service. Someone could have copied the information from there. Worse, North Valley Mutual confirmed the beneficiary form had not been mailed. It had been uploaded electronically. The account used an email address that looked like Arthur's at first glance, but one letter was different. Harold asked whether Arthur ever used a second address. He didn't. Then he asked whether anyone else had access to Arthur's tax files, scanned signatures, or old financial documents. I thought about the previous spring, nearly a year before Arthur's March hospital stay. Melissa had spent an entire Saturday at our house helping him digitize records because she said paper files were too easy to lose. Tax returns, insurance statements, mortgage papers, documents carrying Arthur's signature again and again. I called Daniel back. His voice changed when I mentioned it. Melissa told me Dad asked her to scan those. Did you hear him ask? Silence. Then, quietly, no. At 11:17 that night, Harold sent me one final message before bed. North Valley Mutual had traced the upload location. The beneficiary change had been submitted from an internet connection registered to Daniel and Melissa's home. I was still staring at the screen when the grandfather clock began ticking normally for the first time since Arthur's funeral. Then it struck 4 times, though the hour was nowhere near 4. I walked into the hallway. The hands now pointed to 3:46. And tucked beneath the clock's wooden base, where nothing had been that morning, was one of Arthur's old handwritten tax envelopes with a single word across the front. Melissa. I did not touch the envelope for nearly a minute. Arthur's handwriting was unmistakable, but what frightened me most was not seeing Melissa's name. It was realizing where the envelope had come from. The narrow gap beneath the grandfather clock was part of a hidden compartment Arthur had shown me years earlier, then joked was too small to hide anything worth stealing. I had forgotten it existed. The clock had not produced the envelope. Its movement had shaken loose something Arthur had hidden long before he died. That explanation should have comforted me. Instead, it meant my husband had expected someone to go looking for his papers. Inside was a photocopy of our previous year's tax return, the same document Melissa had scanned at our dining table. Arthur's signature appeared at the bottom. A faint pencil circle surrounded it. Beneath the page, Arthur had written, "She asked why signatures skin so clearly. I told her I didn't know." My knees weakened. There was also a receipt from a Columbus office supply store dated 6 months earlier and a note in Arthur's handwriting directing me to Harold Mercer. I called Harold before sunrise. By 10 that morning, I was sitting across from him while he compared the tax signature with the one on the beneficiary form. "Don't assume anything yet," he warned, but his expression had changed. He contacted Susan Keller, a forensic document examiner in Worthington. Susan studied digital copies of both signatures and found tiny matching defects in the letter W, including a speck created by dust on the original scanner glass. The beneficiary signature had not merely been imitated. It appeared to have been lifted from the tax document Melissa had helped scan. When Daniel arrived at Harold's office, I expected him to defend his wife. Instead, he looked sick. He admitted Melissa had told him Arthur personally asked her to submit the beneficiary change because he was too weak to manage the computer. Daniel had believed her. Worse, he confessed why he wanted to believe her. He and Melissa were carrying more than $140,000 in debt from credit cards, a second mortgage, and an investment that had collapsed. "I needed Dad to have meant it," he said. "That hurt more than anger would have." Harold then showed us the electronic submission records from North Valley Mutual. The form had been uploaded from Daniel and Melissa's home internet connection while Daniel was at work 12 miles away. Melissa had been home, but Harold still wasn't satisfied. "A suspicious upload and a copied signature tell us what may have happened," he said. "They don't tell us whether Arthur anticipated it." Then he unlocked a lower cabinet behind his desk. Inside was a thick sealed envelope bearing Arthur's handwriting. My name was written across the front. Harold told me Arthur had delivered it personally 6 months before his death with strict instructions not to open it unless someone attempted to alter my beneficiary status. My mouth went dry. Harold broke the seal. The grandfather clock's strange ticking suddenly made terrible sense to me. Arthur had not been haunting the house to warn me after his death. He had been warning me while he was still alive. Harold pulled out the first document, read 2 lines, and went completely still. "Arthur didn't just name the person he was afraid of," he said. He wrote down the exact lie he expected that person to tell Daniel about the $850,000 policy. Harold did not read Melissa's name aloud at first. He turned the page toward Daniel and let him see it himself. My son stared at the sentence until his face lost color. Arthur had written that Melissa had been asking questions about changing life insurance beneficiaries without the policyholder appearing in person. He had noticed. He had been watching. And instead of confronting her, he had prepared for what might come next. Harold pulled out a notarized affidavit dated 6 months before Arthur died. In it, Arthur confirmed that I was to remain the sole beneficiary of the $850,000 policy. More important, he had already filed a verification instruction with North Valley Mutual requiring any future beneficiary change to be confirmed in person or through a recorded video call with a company representative. An unverified form would not be accepted as final. It would be placed on hold for review. That was why the company had sent the dispute notice after Arthur died, instead of simply paying Daniel. No third-party delivery. No electronic form alone. My hands went cold. The March 14th document had never met those requirements. Even if the signature had been perfect, the change could not become final without verification. Daniel pushed back from the table. "Melissa told me Dad wanted me protected." His voice cracked. "She said he was worried about our debt." Harold looked at him carefully. "Did Arthur ever tell you that himself?" Daniel said nothing. That silence answered for him. Then Susan Keller called. Her final comparison was complete. The signature on the beneficiary form matched the scanned tax signature down to microscopic defects. It had been copied, not written, not traced by hand. Copied. Every excuse Melissa had offered began collapsing at once. The notary had never met Arthur. The upload came from Melissa's house. The signature came from a file she had scanned. And Arthur had already warned Harold that she was asking questions about beneficiary changes. Daniel covered his face. "I wanted it to be true," he said. "We owe more than $140,000. I wanted to believe Dad was fixing it. I looked at my son and finally understood the ugliest part. Melissa had used his desperation as carefully as she had used Arthur's signature. But Harold was not finished. He had asked North Valley Mutual to preserve the technical records from the fake email Daniel had shown us. A specialist named Evan Brooks traced the message. It had not been sent from Arthur's laptop. It had been composed on a tablet connected to Daniel and Melissa's home network. Daniel looked up sharply. "We only have one tablet." Before anyone could speak, my phone rang. It was Melissa. I put it on speaker. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Evelyn, Daniel needs to come home. Harold is filling your head with nonsense." Then the grandfather clock at my house began chiming through the security app on my phone. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched the live camera feed. The hands were spinning forward on their own, faster than I had ever seen them move. They stopped at 4:17. Harold suddenly looked back at Arthur's sealed papers. Beneath the final page was a printed cloud security notice addressed to Arthur. Daniel remembered why immediately. Arthur had set up their tablet as a Christmas gift 2 years earlier and had remained the recovery contact on the account. The notice showed an automatic backup at 4:17 a.m. 6 months before Arthur died. Arthur had circled the time and written one last instruction beside it. "If Evelyn ever sees 4:17, tell her to check the tablet backup." Daniel stared at me. Then he turned toward the speaker and asked Melissa one question. "Did my father ever actually promise me any of that money?" For the first time, Melissa had no answer. Melissa's silence lasted only 4 seconds, but it told Daniel more than any confession could have. He ended the call. Daniel unlocked the cloud account he still shared with Melissa and gave Evan Brooks permission to inspect the tablet backup while Harold and I watched. At first, it was ordinary. Grocery lists, mortgage statements, photos. Then Evan Brooks found a deleted folder restored automatically at 4:17 a.m. 6 months earlier. Inside were searches about beneficiary changes, copied notary credentials, and a scanned image of Arthur's tax signature. There was also a draft email written in Arthur's voice, the same one Daniel later received. Melissa had prepared it months before Arthur died. Daniel stared at the screen and whispered, "She planned all of this." But one file mattered more than the rest. A short audio recording. Arthur's voice. Tired, but clear. He said he had noticed Melissa asking about his insurance and scanning documents she did not need. He said he had protected the policy through Harold because he did not want me forced to fight over money while grieving. Then he said something that broke me open. "Evie always believes people can come back to who they were. I hope Daniel does. But I won't make her pay for that hope." That was the last piece. North Valley Mutual rejected the beneficiary change. The copied signature, false email, invalid notarization, and tablet records left no room for argument. Melissa faced the consequences through attorneys and investigators. Daniel received nothing from the policy. I did not celebrate. He had still chosen the story that benefited him because he wanted it to be true. Weeks later, he came to my house alone. No paperwork. No questions about money. He sat at the same kitchen table and said, "Mom, I believed her because I was scared of losing everything." I answered, "And you almost lost me instead." He cried quietly. I did not promise forgiveness that day. I only told him he could earn his way back. The $850,000 paid off the remaining $74,000 mortgage and gave me security Arthur had clearly intended. But the clock still bothered me. Harold eventually found the practical answer hidden in Arthur's notes. Months earlier, Arthur had installed a small digital controller behind the old movement because the clock kept losing time. After he began suspecting Melissa, he changed its diagnostic sequence and stored 2 private marker times. 3:42, the time printed on the disputed notary stamp, and 4:17, the time on the cloud backup notice. His notes even listed the intermediate test pulses I had witnessed. 3 ticks forward to 3:45, 1 more minute to 3:46 for chimes, and finally a rapid sweep to 4:17. A brief power interruption after the funeral had restarted that old sequence. The movement had also shaken Arthur's envelope loose from the hidden compartment. The clock had not been carrying a message from beyond. Arthur had built the message while he was still alive. At least, that was the explanation. On the first Sunday of October, I drove 12 miles to Arthur's grave with his old coffee thermos beside me. I told him the house was still mine. I told him Daniel had called twice without mentioning $1. I told him I finally understood why he had kept the policy secret. Before I left, I checked my watch. It was 4:17. Somewhere far off, church bells began ringing. I smiled despite myself and said, "All right, Arthur. Once was machinery. Twice was coincidence. You don't get a third." Then I walked back to my car without looking behind me, carrying the strange comfort that some promises keep protecting us long after the person who made them is gone.